From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome everyone. I'm Tomoko Steen at Science, Technology and Business Division. I'm a research specialist there, and today's event is sponsored by the division. We have a distinguished scholar here, and his name is Professor William Jack Schull. He's one of the pioneers in the atomic bomb victims studies of the radiation effect, and ABCC, Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, was established in 1947 under the order of President Truman. And Professor Schull involved in the study of the radiation effect over 50 years. And after his solid study concluded, he wrote one book. Title is Effect of Atomic Radiation, a half-century of studies from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he also closely associated with atomic victims over the years. And most recently, he wrote a book of his feelings, friendship with those victims in Song Among the Ruins. And that is a more personal account of his study at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He's the author of more than 14 books and multiple publications on the radiation effects on humans. And you will hear, especially the recent accident, really made you think about the radiation effect on the human health. And Dr. Schull is going to explain his experience first and how ABCC was established, but also scientific studies on radiation effects. And he will take questions, anything you have about the current situation as well. So before further ado, please join me welcome Professor William Schull.
Thank you very much, Dr. Steen. I stand before you in a somewhat confused posture. What I will be talking about involves some science, involves some history. It involves, obviously, personal impressions very often. I think given the fact that I've been going to and from Japan for 60 years, all of those elements have been conglomerated in some sort of way, and I'm never certain when I'm speaking as one who admires the Japanese culture greatly, and then when I'm speaking as someone who has seen it both at its best and its worst. And I think I can say that faithfully enough because it's generally not realized that during World War II, I was a member of an infantry division that fought in the Pacific, beginning. The first involvement was at Guadalcanal, and the last one was in Luzon. So my initial trip to Japan was one made with a great deal of mixed feelings. But I was so enchanted in a way by what they had managed to do over a relatively short period of time following the war that I've been an advocate, a supporter, a hand clapper, and everything else that goes with that association. So allow me to sometimes stray a bit. What I was telling Dr. Steen a few moments ago, as I've looked back over the periods of time that I've been going to Japan, this is the first one of the accidents that I wasn't in Japan when it happened, leaving aside the bombing, obviously. But I was there when Bravo occurred. I was there when 3 Mile Island occurred. I happened to also be there at the time of Chernobyl. And so I've seen how the Japanese press has matured in some respects and in other respects not changed at all. Just as much misinformation now, relatively probably, as there was at the time of Bravo. I don't think that our press has done any better, and that's quite disturbing to me. However, I can say at the outset, and would, that I'm of the opinion now that if one is really interested, the truth is there to be found. We have, with the modern technology, with the internet and the like, access to a level of truth we've never seen before. It takes a little bit of work, but if you really want to form your own opinions and examine the data as best as you can, then it's there to be examined. You don't have to content yourself with an overnight authority. You don't have to content yourself even with someone who may have been there for a long time. I would urge, if someone went to see what I have done, look at what I have published with skepticism. I don't mean you should be disbelieving, because that's not valuable to anybody, but you should at least wonder, well, do I have the credentials that have been claimed? And I hope you would answer that affirmatively, but who knows? So inform yourselves. Do. You can. It's well worth the time. All right, now let's look at the history. As you know, the two atomic weapons that we have been studying for so many years were detonated in August of 1945. The first one on August 6th in Hiroshima, the second on August 9th in Nagasaki. The studies which have evolved from those initial events are unique in many respects. It isn't just the population, but it's the length of time. If you recall, as Dr. Steen said, that the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission came into existence on April 1, 1947. That's 64 years ago. I know of no population that has been so consistently studied and in the depth and with the breadth that has been true of the survivors of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The nature of those studies have changed over time. In the first 4 or 5 years, the persons who were being examined could be characterized as opportunistic samples. It was basically a situation in which the clinical facilities that existed in the two cities, and I will show you pictures of in a moment, sought to examine as many persons as they could. We had no censuses. The first census of any sort was 1949, and that was a census made primarily to determine who was and who was not exposed and was still residing in the city. The census on which most of the subsequent studies have been built is the 1950 census that occurred in October of that year and was the first post-war census in Japan. At the time of that census, of course, Japan was still occupied. And under the aegis of the occupation and the Japanese Bureau of the Census, a supplementary questionnaire was added to the conventional questionnaire. That supplementary questionnaire sought to determine who had been exposed in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, or strangely enough, in both places. There's a very small group of individuals. At one time, there were about 18 of them that survived both atomic bombings. We don't know how many were exposed to both, but didn't survive the second one. The irony here is that almost all of those individuals were employed by Mitsubishi shipyards. And Mitsubishi had a big facility both in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki. And when the bomb went off in Hiroshima, they immediately set off for Nagasaki, only in time to arrive on the eve of the detonation of that. So they're a very special group, and especially in many respects, interestingly enough, some years later, the governor of Nagasaki was one of those individuals who had been through both atomic bombings. When the census was completed in October of 1950, we knew the names of approximately 285,000 survivors. We'll never know with the precision that we might like how many died in the 5 years that intervened between the bombing and that census. And we know that in many instances the population spread elsewhere. The nice thing, if nice is the appropriate word, for the 285,000, that census was without reference to residents at the time of the census. So we knew people who had left the city to never return and would never have been picked up in any opportunistic sampling. But in this case, the names were available to us. From the outset, the studies have been binational. Initially, the U.S. played the larger role, larger in the sense that while we did not dominate in terms of either the design of the experimental studies or their implementation, the U.S. government was contributing about 90% of the budget to maintain those studies. That has since changed, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But at any rate, as a consequence of our binational origins, the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission had access to the original census forms, and we could, with given the names and address of an individual, ascertain whether they were still alive or dead, and if they were alive or dead, where, if they were still alive, where they might be residing. Japan actually maintains two sorts of separable processes of enumeration. They have the conventional birth and death certificates, and these are managed by the Ministry of Health and now Labor and Welfare. And then they have what's known as the Koseki, which is the household censuses that have been obliged by law since about 1875. That census enumerates all of the members of a family, all of the events that in any fashion alter the composition of that family. So marriage in Japan, legal marriage was not the presentation of a marriage certificate, but the enrollment of one spouse's name into the household register of the other. That was the only legally representable testimony of that particular action. It also includes births, deaths, obviously. It includes adoptions, and in times past, more social information that was probably desirable or was actually needed. Today, those records are closed, although provision can be made for scientific use of the information. The records have always been open to anyone who had the permission of the person whose records you wanted to see. But for years, the records were totally open, and anyone could go in and look at anyone else's household census, and commonly did until relatively recently, and still a disproportionate fraction of all marriages were arranged. And there was a person called a nakodo whose function it was to examine the social worthiness, as if I can use that expression, of one or both spouses. And as a source of information, they invariably went to the household censuses. And so that was available. To those individuals, in a sense, it would probably still be available because they would be acting as a representative of a family and seeking permission, actually of two families, seeking permission to see the record. The fact that is important here is that associated with the household census itself is a place of residence. That's one's formal, one's legal residence in Japan, wherever you may in fact be residing. Most people tend to retain the same legal residence that their families have had. And although you can transfer your residence, that's not prohibited by any manner of means. The availability of that record meant that we could determine where a person was, whether they were still alive or not, and if alive, through our other hat, we could gain access to the death certificate that was filed at the time of the death of the individual, wherever that death might have occurred. We were always concerned about, and still remain concerned about, the individuals who do not reside in the catchment area. The catchment area is basically the city of Hiroshima on the one hand, or the city of Nagasaki on the other. And one wondered about persons who had moved out never to return. The cities, as you might surmise, at the time of the bombing were peculiar aggregations of persons because they were responsive in a sense to what had transpiring in the war. In Hiroshima, for example, though we don't know the exact number, there was probably something between 40 and 60,000 Koreans in Hiroshima who were essentially forced labor that was brought from Korea to Japan. There was a similar number in Nagasaki, basically to replace the young Japanese males who were all in the military at that time. And there were still things to be done, and so these persons were forced into working in the main islands. Most of them, as soon as they could, after the cessation of hostilities, went back to Korea. So they're not included in our studies. And that's unfortunate. There's been an effort to examine them both by the Korean government and more recently by the Japanese government in an effort to resolve some of the problems. You had, in the case of Hiroshima, the military's justification for it as a target was that Hiroshima is the fulcrum of an area that extends about 50 miles along both the east and the west sides of Hiroshima Bay. It extends from Iwakuni, which had been a Japanese naval air station, through Hiroshima itself, which was the headquarters for the southern Japanese armies. And most of the Japanese troops who served overseas, the vast majority of them would have cleared through Hiroshima en route to whatever their ultimate assignment was. On the eastern shore, it extended down to Kure, which was the largest of the Japanese naval stations in terms of the ones that were actually building vessels. The principal naval station itself for troops and the like was really Yokosuka. But you also had present on a large island in the harbor of Hiroshima Bay, Etajima, which was for years, and still is, the Japanese Naval Academy. Their Annapolis was essentially there. It now is the training ground for the self-defense forces, the maritime self-defense forces. At the time, as soon as it was possible to assemble this information, 120,000 approximately individuals were selected, largely based upon distance from the hypocenter, as we could determine. And this has been what is called the lifespan study sample. These individuals, their current life status is examined periodically. Formally, when the records were still open, we did it ourselves. Now, because of our relationship with the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare, the actual examination of the records is done on a contract basis with members of the actual Koseki Ka doing the actual examinations themselves. So the information is the same as was obtained before. Now, there was concern, obviously, not just about the life expectancies and the course and quality of life in the years that a person resided or lived beyond the bombing. There was the question of morbidity, and to pursue that, 23,000 persons initially were selected from the 120,000, and these individuals were examined every other year. The first examination of them in this particular context was 1958, and there's about 5,000 of them who are still being examined now. Gosh, what is it? It's half a century later. I'm not aware of any other epidemiological study, including Framingham, which is the other one that's often mentioned, the study of heart disease primarily in Massachusetts, that has the depth of information that comes from so many examinations. Here's a situation in which we can actually do statistical analyses on one person, because there will be so many observations over time, in excess of 20 on those who have been present from the outset. One of the other things that we've always prided ourselves on, although it really should be the Japanese who receive the credit, is the level of participation. We still have participation rates which are in excess of 70%, and in the first few cycles, we were getting 90-odd% of the individuals who were identified as active participants. Now remember, these are persons who for the most part may be concerned about their health, but they were not acutely ill or anything. Studies that may have higher levels of participation do so often because the person whose participation is being sought is actively ill, and there's a strong, obviously, motivating force for that. In these cases, people came partly out of concern not only for their own health, but for the health of their fellow survivors. It's also usually not recognized. One has a tendency to imagine that virtually all of them must be gone, But in fact, between 38 and 40% of the original samples still very much alive. They're in their 70s now, but Japan, with one of the longest life expectancies of any industrialized nation, we've probably got another 10 or 15 years of examinations that will go on. And this is particularly critical in this instance because there is evidence that would suggest that the younger an individual was, the higher the risk of subsequent morbid events of one sort or another. Now, we don't really know whether that suggests a greater sensitivity associated with a younger body, or whether it's kind of an anticipatory phenomenon that when everything ends, their rates of cancer will be no higher than the rates of cancer among individuals who are older at the time of exposure. We need the 10 years of follow-up to determine that. There are then two other samples, too, that I should mention briefly. Something in excess of 3,000 women were identified who were pregnant at the time of the bombing. A disproportionate number of them, of course, lost their pregnancies. But among those who did not, we still run a clinical program that on the last full cycle examined about 1,600 of the women and their infants. And it's on this group of individuals that we base the evidence for the exceptionally high rates of severe mental retardation that is seen among some of those children, the sum being not random, but being between those who were exposed at times when they were between the 8th and the 15th week of pregnancy. And that makes sense in terms of all that we know about human embryology. This is the period in time in which the cortex of the brain is being populated, and most of the brain cells actually originate, the neurons, in the circumventricular areas that are basically established for that reproduction. And then they move in an assisted migratory process to their ultimate places of function. And so what radiation seems to be doing is impairing that migration process. They are interesting in many other respects. We now know that a neuron that does not establish some sort of connection is quickly removed from the brain. So these people, and we can see it, probably will be able to see it better now with the availability of functional MRIs, they've made it connections, but we don't know exactly where those connections are. The cells are still ectopic, they're in the wrong place, but something has happened. There has been a case made in a few instances of sort of the idiot savant notion. Many of these individuals, now they're 60 years old, are unable to form coherent sentences. They can't calculate well, so they're not to be trusted with change and whatnot. And yet in other respects, they're really very impressive. One that I knew quite well, who is still very much alive, was a baseball fan, and he knew the name and number of every player on the Hiroshima Carps. And I could say the same thing for all of the members of the Tokyo Giants. So he had the capacity to learn, but what they learned were things which society didn't deem the things that they needed to know. So what we'd like to know is, why do they have this capacity? How does it relate to where those neuronal connections have been made? Because it would tell us more about the function of those areas in the brain than we may now have. The last group, and this was the one that was my first involvement, from 1947 through 1953, we examined every infant born in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki. And in those 6 years, we examined 77,000 babies. And those examinations, the nature of Japanese society at the time, automatically meant that the examinations were all at home. Most deliveries were attended by a midwife. Less than 8% of all births occurred in a hospital. And usually when that happened, there was reason for suspicion that there had been a previous pregnancy that did not terminate well. And so the concern was the best available. But the vast majority of them were born at home. If you were in Japan at that time, and still to a very large extent, you would know that the way in which houses are numbered is certainly very confusing for us, because most streets do not have names, and houses were originally numbered in the order in which they were built within an area which was actually would be the residence that you were identified with. You might be house number 10 in Sakamoto Machi. And so all that would tell you that your house was the 10th one to be built in this defined area. And the 11th one might be as far away within that district as you could possibly get and still remain within the district. So we used to figure it would take about 45 minutes to examine one of these infants, and almost half that time was spent in just trying to find where they were. We never had problems with participation. The participation rates were incredibly high, but we'd have to get to the home, and that was a process in which, for the duration of those 6 years, we managed to keep 7 examination teams in the field every day of the year, except for the first 4 days of the new year, which was then and still is the biggest of the holidays, and people were not interested in actually being visited at that time. But the popularity of it was so great that we'd actually have women who would stop us and wonder why we didn't come to see, hadn't seen their baby. And usually we would take them in the order in which they were reported to us, and so theirs might have been reported later than the one we were visiting, and that was the process. The aim primarily was to determine early infant mortality, and to also determine whether or not there was evidence of gross abnormality, what we would define as a major abnormality. Major abnormalities in this context would be any deviation from the norm, which was either life-threatening or was incompatible with effective functioning within the society, such as mental retardation, or was cosmetically disfiguring, like polydactyly or something of that nature. People don't usually die of it, and today they would remove the supernumerary digit, but in that time it wasn't always possible, but you couldn't buy gloves with 6 fingers. So it was a problem that limited the quality of life to some extent, not greatly, but nevertheless it was discomforting to the family, obviously to the individual. We saw no increase in congenital defects amongst this group, nor did we see any increase in premature mortality. At that time, of course, we weren't really able to look at gene-specific effects. All we could look at was, we referred to them as population characteristics of attributes of the newborn that were generally upsetting to women and to the person affected in time. Subsequently, we began first with extensive biochemical studies in 1970, and more recently with DNA studies as that became available. Remember, one of our problems is always we need to wait until the technology is sufficiently well established that it can be done on a large scale, because we're looking at thousands of people all the time. And therefore, the earlier DNA technology simply wasn't applicable on that scale. It could be applied to 1 or 2 families if one had reason for it, but not on a larger scale. Now, the focus of most of the studies, of course, has been one or the other of 3 categories of disorders. Either teratogenesis, which I've said the primary purpose was to determine the effect of ionizing radiation on individuals who were themselves directly exposed, either as children or fetuses or embryos, as the case may be. Cancer, which actually happens to be the biggest of the problems. And then, of course, mutagenesis. And as I've implied very quickly, we don't have evidence of significant differences in mutation rate amongst this population. Certainly nothing that we can establish unequivocally that is functionally related to the dose of the persons. bear in mind that as early as it became practicable, there was a concerted effort to actually determine the probable amount of ionizing radiation to which an individual was exposed who survived the atomic bombing. This obviously meant a lot of measurements. You couldn't measure actually on the person, but you could determine fields of exposure, how the ionizing radiation diminished as a function of distance, whether or not they had certain symptoms that we associate with acute radiation illness. So we built out of a combination of distance, shielding, and whatnot until now. The doses assigned to these individuals have always been given a number of. The very first one was called T57, and that was a dosimetric system that was based on our knowledge as of 1957, and T was that it was tentative. No one has ever yet had courage enough to say, this is it. We always keep hoping that there'll be another one. The next one was DS86. Right now we're using DS03. So this is a system that was promulgated in the year 2003 and represents the culmination of an enormous amount of work, both in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki, but in the test sites and at Las Vegas, as well as the obvious growth in our understanding of the physics of the case. As one measure of the intensity of this effort, clearly we determined very early on that the vast majority of individuals who survived because they were shielded. They weren't standing in the open when this event went off, and therefore it was important to know how the shielding affected the actual amount of exposure that they had. And to this end, there was a very large study done at Las Vegas, a little book published on it called Ichiban, and in which Japanese houses were actually built in Japan, disassembled, brought to Las Vegas, along with the Japanese carpenters, to reassemble the house, and then radiation sources were mounted on towers, and inside at 3-foot intervals we could measure all of this. Initially it was just a handful. Subsequently it got up to where there were about 12 of those houses, so that they could be grouped in ways that you could see how one house would shield another house. But it was an enormous effort. Now, what I'm going to be running out of my time if I don't stop soon. Effects. The convention is that we measure risk in 3 different ways. One way is called absolute risk. And in this particular instance, what we try to determine or to ascertain from the information that we have, the number of additional cases that one would see in the population as a function of their exposure. So these are case-oriented observations. And you're always contrasting the population with 0 dose. In fact, no one has quite so low a dose, but for practical purposes, they are the comparison group. That's absolute. It's case-oriented. Then there's what is known as the relative risk, and that is how does that increase relate on a relative scale to what would normally be occurring. And then the final one, and the one which is often most informative, I think, is called the attributable risk. And in this, what one seeks to do is, among a collection of cancers, let us say, to determine which ones were most probably an outgrowth of actual exposure, and what number would have occurred without that exposure. The highest attributable risk that we know relates to leukemia. And in this particular instance, we can say with fairly high certainty that something of the order of 55 to 58% of all of the cases in leukemia that have occurred in Hiroshima and Nagasaki within the population of survivors would not have occurred if they hadn't been exposed. Remember, too, that leukemia was the first of the cancers where the evidence became persuasive that this was indeed radiation-related. All of the cancers have associated with them what is called a latency, or a latent period, and that is the interval of time that intervenes between the exposure and when the cancer appears, and relates obviously to the mechanics of population growth. For leukemia, the latency is only 2 years, so we started seeing an increase of leukemia about 1958. For solid tumors, the latency is much longer. More of the order of 15 years was elapsed before we saw the first of the solid tumors. And the first that we were seeing were tumors of the thyroid and of the lung. Now, in the case of the solid tumors, viewed in aggregate, about 8% are attributable to exposure. So as contrasted with leukemia, it's a relatively small number, hardly would be identified as an epidemic. One can, I would certainly support the notion that any case is unfortunate under those circumstances, but you wouldn't scrap your healthcare system on an increase no greater than that. Remember that in that same interval of time, more than 25% of people will die of cancer which is not attributable to the radiation. So that's a sizable group. As I've implied, all three of these measures have been higher for the young, and we are most anxious to continue the studies until such time as we can determine what may be the origin of that. Now there's the question of second primaries. The information that comes to us through a variety of sources. One is the clinical examinations that I've referred to. A second is the existence of tumor registries. Tumor registries have existed in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki since 1957 in the case of Hiroshima, 58 in the case of Nagasaki. Those are two of the oldest registries in the country, and they're older than most cancer registries in the United States too, for that matter. So we have pathological observations on most instances. We actually have tissue from the tumor, so that as categorization of tumors becomes more specific and better known, we can go back to this material and reclassify, if need be, as to the type of malignancy it may be. The other, of course, is the statement that we get from the Ministry of Health as to the cause of death at the time of death occurring. Let me show you a few slides. I'm particularly interested in you realizing this, that over that period of time, I would be hard-pressed to say how many cycles of construction have gone on in Hiroshima, but I can tell you it's not less than 5. So there's virtually nothing standing from 1945 except those things which have been deliberately left as memorials to the persons who died. The first, as I will show you a picture taken in 1954, I think it was when I took it, the city of Hiroshima, there's hardly any spots that are open. They've already reconstructed. This is, 9 years after the event. The city had completely rebuilt. And that was not the first cycle. The first cycle had started almost instantaneously. When I was first going to Japan, there used to be a bookstore that was virtually at ground zero, and it advertised itself as the atomic bomb bookstore. So there was an acceptance, at least among some, of the peculiarities. And now, let's see. All I have to do is here we go. This picture was taken in 1949. What you would see today is still obviously characteristic of this building. This was the exhibition and industrial hall that had been built at about the time of World War I, and is a few hundred yards from the actual hypocenter itself. And this was what stood. It was a reinforced, as you can see, steel construction. Just off the edge of the bombing target, we were told, was a T-bridge. Hiroshima is, in the main, very flat. It is the delta of the Ota River, which arises in the mountains to the east, to the north, primarily, of Hiroshima. When it hits Nagasaki Bay, it has established a number of branches. There are about 6. And the city has grown up on recovered land which lies between those branches. So facetiously in Japan, Hiroshima is always characterized as bars, bridges, and branches, because obviously with a city made up of a collection of islands, there were a lot of bridges, and still are. And that was both a saving grace and an unfortunate thing at the time of the bombing, because the water mains were usually passed from one island to another on the side of the bridges. And the bridges were moved on their pilings, and of course it ruptured the water lines, and there was no pressure with which they could fight the fire. And of course the biggest fire station had to be very close to the hypocenter, and most of the firemen were not only killed and their equipment was destroyed too. But even had that not been so, the very absence of enough water pressure to effectively combat the fires meant that the fires in the most parts of the cities just burned themselves out. They were stopped by a wider branch of the river, and the winds had begun to abate. So within a distance of 2 kilometers of the hypocenter, virtually everything was destroyed. The only things that withstood were reinforced concrete buildings, but they were, without exception, to my recollection, gutted. Anything that was inflammable inside was set afire. Remember, the construction of Japanese homes then was far more fire-prone than is now. It was largely paper and wood, with mud wattle being a more solid sort of wall. Okay, so here, this you'd still see, it wouldn't look anything like this. Now it's fancied up. It's the center of a major tourist industry. This you don't see anymore either. Obviously, both cities were confronted with having to dispose of tens of thousands of bodies in a very short period of time. And so most of them, since many were burned beyond recognition, ended up in mass graves. This was one such mass grave on a little island called Ninoshima in the harbor of Hiroshima proper. But I simply want you to reckon with the fact that very early on people were sensitive to the families and others who were involved in this and did what they could to honor that sacrifice. Here's one which is, when I first saw it, I was amazed that anyone would even think of such a thing. But as you can see, I'm sorry, I really needed a bigger picture. The central figure is holding a book, and on that book it says E = mc squared, which is the fundamental energy relationship. The 2 girls who are beside her, one's holding a dove for peace, and the other is holding a laureate of flowers. This is a tribute to a group of young women, most of them 15, 16 years old, almost all of whom lost their lives in relatively quick times following the bombing. They went to a common school. One of the districts in Hiroshima is known as Funairi, and they were students at the Funairi High School, and they had been drafted into work on a fire lane because the city government authorities were aware that Hiroshima had not been bombed and that they were going to be treated sooner or later. And of course they were anticipating incendiary raids, and they wanted some means of breaking the fires if they possibly could. And so these girls were helping to set up a fire break when they were exposed. I'll show you a picture of the fire break that emerged. It was 100 meters wide, and it was known as the 100-meter road. Today, if you've been in Hiroshima, it's what's called Heiwadori, Peace Drive, or road, whichever you want. This was our humble beginning. This was what was called a Butler building, and this is where the facilities that now have been in charge of these studies for all these many years began. Adjacent to it, this picture doesn't show it, on the right was a large building called the Gaisenkan, which literally translates as the Hall of Triumphant Return. And this was where presumably the soldiers would come back after the war, victors of their involvement. You can see all of the trucks beside the building. That was our motor pool. At one time we had about 75 vehicles involved in these studies, including 3 sizable buses, because there were places for us to live in Hiroshima. We lived 25 miles away and were brought back and forth to the studies each day in these buses. This is now the quarters where most of the Americans live who are associated with the study. The ultimate site for the facilities is it's called Hijiyama, Yama literally meaning a mountain, but for most of us we wouldn't so see it. It's just a big hill. It's probably about 300 feet at most from the sea level to the top of the hill. And our facilities are on that hill, and this is where, as I say, those who are single and living there can live if they wish. They're not obliged to live there. This building was constructed in late 1953. This is the entrance to the clinical facilities. The architects were Skidmore and Owens, who were well regarded in the United States for designing hospitals, and the National Academy opted for them as the contractors and construction people. And they were under the assumption, obviously, that typhoons were common in Hiroshima, and that's really not quite so. It doesn't get hit nearly as much as those cities which are coastal. It's on the inland sea, but protected in large measure from the south by the island of Shikoku. So they put up all of these sort of oversized Quonset buildings. You see, you can count 4 here. I think there are actually 7 now. And it was at one time arguably the best research facility in Japan. It's not true any longer by any manner of means. Here is the first of the memorials. You can't really see, but there used to be a sign here. It was nothing more than a stage, and at that time there would be a memorial service with both religious and non-religious connotations, and there was always a sign that said, "No more Hiroshimas." As the economic situation began to improve, things got better in Japan. Of course, that all changed, and by 1954, they had started this construction, which is the A-bomb Museum in Hiroshima. If any of you have been there, you would have seen this without question. This was very early in the construction period. It's now 2 floors, and as you'll see from another picture, the exhibition hall is directly behind us. In this urge to rebuild, Japan turned to some of its expatriated sons, and one of the persons who was well regarded at that time then and still is Isamu Noguchi. And Noguchi designed this bridge. It has well, it doesn't seem, this is not a good choice of words, but there's a phallic connotation to this when you see the other bridge. There were 2 bridges. This is the one which, if memory serves me correctly, was the most easterly. You came onto an island, and there was a similar bridge, which I'll show you, that would have been to the far right. The area where the Peace Memorial is now is between these 2 bridges. Here's the first construction of the cenotaph. This is where each August 6th, the cenotaph is opened, and the names are added of all of the individuals who have died, who were survivors in the intervening year. Yes, as you can see, this was a winter picture. Okay, this is a picture of Hiroshima taken in the winter of 1954. And you can see this deltoidal plains all full of buildings again. This is 9 years afterwards. This was the 100-meter road. At that time, the 100-meter road just stopped. This particular branch is known as the Kyogawa. The road stopped there. Today, it's a very attractive and marvelously done street, and it comes across into a tunnel, which then feeds on into a major highway, so that it is no longer a sort of a dead end. This is looking towards the harbor. In the in the middle and late 1940s, if you were any place, this is the inland sea that we're looking at, you would have seen wrecks of Japanese naval vessels everywhere. It ended up being an enormous source of iron for the Japanese as their economy began to improve, largely as an outgrowth of the Korean War. The decision was made at the time the Korean War began to offshore purchase as much as was possible. And Japan had the capabilities, or was rebuilding the capabilities, so things like water trailers and all the rest of them were being built in Japan. And that ultimately provided the money which allowed them to expand. And they had the good fortune to have, good fortune again, poor choice of words. Much of the machinery in their factories, which would have been outdated, had been destroyed. So they were rebuilding their steel mills at a time when our steel mills were becoming badly dated, and they had the best rolling stock that you could get. So they did extremely well as an outgrowth of that, but the financial support came out of this offshore purchasing. This is me. You may not actually recognize me, but at any rate, that's me. This would have been taken in the fall of 1951. And this was my successor, Duncan MacDonald. And these 5 women were the principal officers of the Midwives Association. I mentioned, how important they were in the genetics program. This little lady, whose name was Setsuko Yamamoto, became a great friend. She was already in her 60s, and despite the hair, nobody had gray hair in Japan in those days. They always dyed it if it began to appear gray. And Mrs. Yamamoto was, despite her small size, she ran the nursing group, the midwife group, with vigor and a firm hand. There were about 150 people. And here's the other Noguchi Bridge. You can see this is the curved arch sort of thing. Oh, sorry. I keep looking at the wrong thing, and I keep trying not to look at Dr. Steen, who keep waving this piece of paper in front of me. I'm sorry. She knew that she was taking a calculated risk, because when I start talking about Japan, hours go by if you don't watch, and I obviously shouldn't. This is just another access route to that bridge. Here's an overly exuberant veteran. This kind of garment would have been very common at that point in time. The hat was the conventional Japanese Army hat, and his leggings and so on. I don't know what he would have been celebrating at that time, because this was probably taken in January or February of '54. If it were May, it would have been the annual viewing of the flowers. These are pictures. Now, this is the Nagasaki University Medical School. It was about 1,200 meters. It varied from roughly 800 meters to 1,200 meters, depending upon what part of the medical complex you were talking about. Hiroshima did not have a medical school at that time, so it didn't lose a large fraction of its young trainees. There is a medical school there now. Hiroshima's major hospital, the Hiroshima Red Cross Hospital, which was the most modern in the city, suffered badly but remained functional, at least as a sort of an upper-level aid station. This is Nagasaki looking north. Nagasaki was saved from some of the devastation by virtue of its geography. There's 2 major valleys, and these valleys are separated by a mountain range, the principal peak of which is called Kompira, and it's about 1,500 to 1,800 feet. And that's the elevation at which the bombs were detonated, about 1,500 feet. So this is the entrance to the medical school's hospital. Oh, this is just a little farther down. For those of you who get back and forth to Japan, this is a view you will never see again because it doesn't exist. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's Imperial Hotel. And it was destroyed in the 1960s and replaced by a very high skyscraper. But this particular building achieved a great deal of notoriety. It was where Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio stayed when they did their honeymoon in Japan. And as a matter of fact, the Japanese newspapers had so much attention that there used to be a big flat stone. All of them would try to get up high enough that they could take a picture. The stone actually broke under the weight of all of these correspondents. This is downtown Tokyo. This is in fact the Ginza, the most important street in the city, as it would have looked in 1949. And streetcars and all the rest of it, you can see how. I offer these only to show you how much has been achieved by the Japanese towards bettering their own lives. Now, yes.
Is there any residual radiation left in either of the cities that's measurable?
It is measurable if your instrumentation is sufficiently good, but it would not be a level that anyone would associate with identifiable health consequences. The bulk of the radiation, see, in both cities, of course, what happened was that the areas with the highest amount of radiation were immediately beneath the point of detonation. In both cities, those areas were set afire, and it was days, in many instances, before people could actually get into those regions, largely because of the fire. And the bulk, by 48 hours, the bulk of the initial radiation had dissipated. And so the levels of exposure there are not great. Not great enough that we can even with certainty point to health effects from that. In both cities there was a fallout zone. Those are the ones which you can still measure. And in the case of Hiroshima, the fallout zone was about 3 kilometers to the northwest of the hypocenter in an area known as Koi Kusatsu. And in Nagasaki, it was about the same distance, but there to the east of the hypocenter, around a reservoir. And there has been great concern as to whether or not that reservoir was contaminated. Japanese investigators themselves have never been able to show anything. You could find evidence early on, even as late as 1960, of increased radiation in some of the plants grown in the soil. But we can't show it biologically. One of the areas that we've always been interested in, again, and we can't show biologically, we know that because of the nature of the construction of the Hiroshima weapon, it was falling canted at about 17-degree angle. And we've looked for evidence of penumbra that might have supported that, what we are pretty certain was happening. But there's no hot spot or anything else that we can identify that goes on there. So the distance is small. Yes?
Have you formed an opinion of a reliable news source for the recent atomic troubles in Japan?
I have been going primarily to the NHK's English website. But the best reports that I've seen so far in terms of measured, objective accountings, I have found in the BBC News. And there's two in particular that I would urge you if you're interested. One is an assessment of the issue by Richard Wakeford. Richard Wakeford is a health physicist who's at the Dalton Nuclear Laboratory at Manchester. It was published, I think, on the 18th, if I remember correctly, 18th of March. The other publication was by a health physicist at Oxford, whose name is Wade Allison. And that was published around the 26th or something like that. It was roughly a week later. But if you look for BBC News, the article that was primarily attributable to Wakeford is called Fukushima Disaster or Distraction, question mark, because his conclusion is it's a detraction, a distraction. It's really not anything else. And they have gone through and compared what was known then of the releases with what happened in Chernobyl. And the consensus is that in sum, the releases from the accident in Fukushima is not more than 1% of what was released at Chernobyl. So it by all other standards, it really isn't a major event. Yes?
This is a historical question. I learned about the atomic bombing casualty commission's work from Susan Lindy's book.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you can talk to us about, in her book she describes the difficulty in the first couple of years of actually figuring out dosage rates and exposures. There were several reasons that conditioned the difficulty. One was that they were using different spellings and different ways of doing addresses, so it was difficult to find people and figure out if it was the same person. But second, there were the social and cultural conditions around actually speaking about where you were, whether or not your spouse even knew you were exposed. And I wonder if you can basically enumerate the uncertainties that made the actual collection of data difficult.
I will in just a moment. First of all, I know Susan.
Yeah.
And I guess I would put her in the category that I mentioned at the outset. Look at their source and what are their credentials. Susan Lindy made much of the fact that we didn't publish data on minor abnormalities. We have the data. We didn't publish it because none of them have serious health consequences, and they're all due to essentially 5 abnormalities. What are called auricular pits, in which there are little holes in the lobe of the ear, auricular appendages, in which there are growths that are there, knuckle hemangiomas, so there's a colored spot at the base of the neck, umbilical hernia. Now, an umbilical hernia can be a serious proposition if there is enough extrusion of bowel. But for most of those, there really was nothing of consequence. These are things which the vast majority of them would have vanished by the time the child was a year old. Even the knuckle hemangiomas, those disappeared. The pits and the excrescences on the ear is a different matter, but it's nothing of real consequence. Susan, remember, she's there much later, and she'd already, I think, her sources are all secondary, let me put it that way. And she had been much influenced by, oh God, his name is eluding me. This is one of the problems with age. He was a psychiatrist at Yale, Robert Lifton.
Yeah.
Robert Lifton, you know,
Right, sure.
also wrote an opinionated piece because he didn't have the command of Japanese that would be needed to do in-depth analyses of a person's feelings. He was working with interpreters too.
But
And
I
so-
guess so my background is the construction of new scientific knowledge.
Right.
And you participated in a great deal of figuring out what standards are and literally inventing all the protocols around data collection. So it has to be the case that at the very beginning, the first couple of years of the agencies,
We were learning. We were learning.
exposure
Yep.
shielding, how do we talk about it? How do you negotiate with the midwife? So I wonder if you can speak
Um,
about the invention of this data collection effort.
Well, there is, you know, you mentioned 2 things. Naming, that was always a problem. It's even a problem in Japan among Japanese, and it used to be more common than perhaps it is now. A person would write the kanji for his name in the air when he was talking to somebody, so that you know, you could write the same sound, hana, for example, as a nose or a flower, and there are other meanings to it too. If you don't know the character, context doesn't always tell you what the meaning is, and so we had to cope with that. The Japanese own governmental system had been one in which they used the syllabary, generally the cursive one, the hiragana, and in what were called furigana. And this was adjacent to the kanji, in very small print, would be written the pronunciation of it. So once we tumbled the fact that there was a way of determining these things, not in every instance, but in many instances, obviously, we began to learn more about it. The dosimetry, well, imagine the situation yourself. If you are fortunate enough to have been behind a fence or a tree or something so that you weren't killed outright, when whatever loss of mentation would have accompanied so traumatic an event had occurred, and you come to, the world that you knew isn't there anymore. And so you're trying to figure out whether you were standing by this corner or that corner. And we always had problems initially with that. Finally, what happened was the focus became more and more on people within dwellings. And there wasn't a difficulty because we had aerial photographs before and after the bombing. And the individuals, as they were interviewed, this would be an interview that would run several hours in many instances, could pick their house out of these aerial photos. And because Japanese house construction was modular and the unit is the mat, they could tell you, well, this is a 3-mat room and that was a 4-mat room, or whatever the case may be. So you even had a very good sense of what the overall area was. So we learned as we were going along. You know, it was. I think that process would be true. I know it was true. I was involved with the Chernobyl follow-up, and I didn't know how medical records were stored in Russia, and they're a mess. And so when we were trying to verify diagnoses that had presumably been made at hospitals, it was very hard to find the original medical record because it could have been in the last clinical service that a person appeared in. There were no central libraries such as our hospitals have. And so you had a considerable difficulty, you know, there as here. And we were working through Russian members of the Institute of Radiation Medicine in Kiev. And they had the same problem we did. It wasn't just that we couldn't find them, they couldn't find them either. And when you have that kind of difficulty, obviously in the case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one of the problems that have always confronted us is we never really knew how many soldiers were there because their records all went up in smoke. And many of them used that obviously as an excuse to separate themselves from the military. They went home on permanent leave. And one could certainly not blame them. And it's only much later that we found that a substantial number of the troops were actually on maneuvers. So they weren't really in the city, even though the castle and all of the buildings that were associated with the parade grounds were going. Yes?
As a Gaijin, did you observe the society regarding the victims with ostracism or with compassion?
Well, I thought it was with compassion. At least I tried to be compassionate. And for example, when we were doing the brain studies, I went with every patient. At that time, Hiroshima did not have an MRI facility with enough strength to do the kinds of studies we were envisaging. The university in Fukuoka, Kyushu University, agreed to help us, and we would bring the people down there to be examined. I went through that apparatus several times myself, personally, so I knew exactly what was going to happen to them, and I could explain to the mother, who was usually with us, even though by that time when we were making these studies, they were 48 or so. That is the child. The child is what you should call him. But no, we were sensitive to that. And
I mean, how about the Japanese society generally, though? I understand you were obviously compassionate toward these people, but how did society treat them? Japanese society.
Well, there's a lot of uncertainty because it's hard to separate what really happened from the news that has circulated. For example, there was concern in many families that if it was known that the daughter was a survivor of the bombing or a child of a survivor, that they might have difficulty arranging a marriage. And so we tried to determine whether that was or was not so. And a very well-regarded social scientist, Scott Matsumoto, who some of you may know, who was at the University of Hawaii, undertook a large study. And the outcome of it was they were married just as frequently as everybody else was. But there may have been apprehension, but it didn't translate into action. These flurries always occur when there's an accident. Things got worse when Bravo occurred. Thank God, people were coming in to ask us whether they could buy fish or not. Should they buy fish? You tried to be honest with them and let them know what you could, but they were so apprehensive, and the newspapers weren't helping.
Sorry, I just want, I apologize for hogging the questions, but I'm married to a Japanese woman, and I have relatives, you know, in Chiba.
Uh-huh.
And I'm wondering if I've obviously encouraged them, you know, hearing the news that everybody else has been hearing, to, you know, come over and set up my basement as a, you know, refugee, you know, thing, and let everybody, you know, at least the children at least, to get some respite. But because I hear they're breathing the air and they're drinking the water, etc. And it's a great concern to me. I was in Europe when Chernobyl hit, and I made the decision to leave. So it has a personal resonance with me. But I'm wondering, would you hesitate to eat the fish and drink the water and live over in
I certainly would not.
Okay.
I've probably had more radiation in the course of my life than you'll get from anything that comes
Okay.
from that.
That's
And,
encouraging. Thank you.
It wouldn't lead me to do one thing and not another.
Okay.
I think it's time is running out. Please join me to thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Schull.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.